The House Judiciary Committee chamber erupted in chaos as Stephen Miller's face turned crimson, his sixth interruption drowning out Jasmine Crockett's question about children who died in detention. "You don't understand immigration law," he sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. But Crockett remained perfectly still, waiting for silence before pulling out a manila folder. When she spoke, her voice cut through the tension like ice. "Mr. Miller, you've interrupted me 6 times to spread your hate. Now you'll sit there silently while I read your own words about children in cages, or I'll have the Sergeant-at-Arms enforce committee rules." The architect of family separation suddenly looked very small as he realized his usual tactics had just spectacularly backfired. The confrontation that would expose the dark heart of American immigration extremism brought together two figures representing opposite visions of America's future. Stephen Miller, the former Trump White House senior advisor who had engineered the cruelest immigration policies in modern history, had built his entire identity around reducing non-white immigration while wrapping his white nationalism in bureaucratic language. His rapid-fire interruption style had served him well in cable news appearances where hosts rarely pushed back. Jasmine Crockett represented everything Miller's worldview feared, a young black woman with prosecutorial skills who refused to be silenced, who had spent years defending immigrants targeted by Miller's policies, and who understood that his rhetoric was designed to overwhelm rather than illuminate. This hearing on immigration reform would become the moment Miller's tactics finally met their match. The hearing had begun with Miller in his element, delivering prepared remarks about invasion, replacement, and protecting American workers with the practiced ease of someone who had repeated these talking points thousands of times. Republican committee members nodded along as he painted apocalyptic pictures of border chaos and cultural destruction. When Democratic members questioned him, he employed his signature strategy of interrupting with statistics, rapid-fire deflections, and accusations of emotional manipulation. He had already steamrolled 3 representatives when Crockett's turn arrived. She began with a simple question about Maria, a 7-year-old who died of dehydration in custody after being separated from her father. Miller immediately interrupted, his voice rising as he launched into statistics about drug trafficking and MS-13. Crockett tried to continue, but Miller talked over her, claiming she was using sub-stories to avoid discussing the real issues. The committee chair, a Republican, made no effort to maintain order as Miller continued his verbal assault. When Crockett attempted to ask about families still separated years later, Miller interrupted again, this time suggesting she doesn't understand the complexity of border enforcement. His third interruption came with accusations that Democrats wanted open borders. The fourth claimed she was pushing replacement theory in reverse. The fifth suggested she hated America. By the sixth interruption, where he sneered that she was pushing emotional manipulation over facts, even some Republican members were shifting uncomfortably at his aggressive disrespect. That's when Crockett's entire demeanor shifted. She closed her original folder and pulled out a different one, thicker, with tabs marking different sections. The way she moved, deliberate and controlled, commanded attention. Miller was still mid-rant when she raised a hand and spoke with prosecutorial authority that silenced the room. After warning him about the Sergeant-at-Arms, she began reading from the folder. "Mr. Miller, these are your emails from your time in the White House. Let's discuss what you really think about immigration." Miller's face went from red to pale as she read his correspondence with white nationalist groups, messages where he explicitly discussed using immigration policy to preserve America's European heritage. The committee room fell silent except for Crockett's steady voice reading Miller's own words. Emails where he celebrated family separations as a deterrent to breeding. Messages suggesting they deny medical care to detain children to discourage future attempts. Communications with far-right websites coordinating messaging about white genocide and the Great Replacement. Each revelation was worse than the last. Miller attempted to interrupt, claiming the emails were fabricated, but Crockett held up a hand and continued reading. She had emails where Miller specifically requested that agents separate nursing infants from their mothers, calling it maximum impact deterrence. The most damaging revelations came when Crockett presented Miller's correspondence with admitted white supremacists, including his praise for explicitly racist immigration policies from the 1920s designed to exclude non-Northern Europeans. She read his email calling the 1965 Immigration Act the beginning of America's racial suicide and his proposal to use census data to target Latino communities for raids regardless of citizenship status. Democratic members gasped while Republicans studied their phones, unable to defend what they were hearing. Miller's usual confident sneer had been replaced by something between panic and rage as his private thoughts were exposed to public scrutiny. Then Crockett revealed what would become the defining moment of the confrontation. She pulled out historical documents, ship manifests from 1903 showing the arrival of Wolf Lieb Glosser, Miller's great-grandfather, who had fled pogroms in Belarus. She presented immigration records showing Glosser had entered with falsified documents, claiming to be a merchant when he was actually destitute. She showed how Miller's family had received public assistance, had benefited from chain migration as they brought over relatives, and had changed their names to sound less foreign. Every policy Miller championed would have excluded his own family from America. Miller exploded, standing and shouting that Crockett was pushing white genocide theory and hating America. But Crockett remained seated, her voice calm but forceful as she delivered her devastating response. Your great-grandfather fled genocide and found refuge here. You're using his sanctuary to engineer genocide against others. You're not protecting America, Stephen. You're betraying everything that allowed your family to survive. The difference between your grandfather and today's asylum seekers isn't their desperation, it's their skin color. And everyone in this room knows it. She continued while Miller stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing without sound. You've spent your career pulling up the ladder your own family climbed. You've weaponized the government against people exactly like your great-grandfather, desperate, fleeing violence, seeking safety. You call them invaders, but your family were refugees. You call it replacement, but your family replaced someone too. You demand they speak English, but your great-grandfather died barely speaking it. Every cruel policy you've created would have condemned your own bloodline to death in Belarus. The committee room erupted. Democratic members demanded Miller respond to the emails. Protesters in the gallery began chanting shame. Republican members called for recess, but the committee chair had lost control. Miller looked desperately at his Republican allies, but even they couldn't defend emails explicitly discussing racial engineering through immigration policy. His chief defender, Representative Gosar, attempted to suggest the emails were out of context, but fell silent when Crockett offered to read the full chains. Miller's assistant was frantically whispering in his ear, apparently urging him to leave. The final humiliation came when Crockett presented one last document, a letter from Miller's own uncle, Dr. David Glosser, publicly condemning his nephew for betraying their family's refugee history. She read Dr. Glosser's words, "Stephen's policies would have destroyed our family. He has become the architect of concentration camps for children, the very evil our family fled." Miller's face had gone from pale to almost gray. Without warning, he grabbed his materials and stormed toward the exit, his dramatic departure caught by every camera in the room. As he reached the door, Crockett called out one final time, "Mr. Miller, you forgot to answer my question about Maria, the 7-year-old who died. But I suppose some children matter more to you than others." Within minutes, #MillerExposed was trending globally. The emails Crockett had read became front-page news, with civil rights organizations calling for investigations into Miller's connections with white supremacist groups. Jewish organizations condemned his betrayal of his own family's refugee history. The ship manifests showing his great-grandfather's immigration became viral images, shared with captions about historic hypocrisy. Even conservative outlets struggled to defend Miller, with several calling for him to be excluded from future Republican administrations. The footage of him storming out while Crockett calmly continued presenting evidence became symbolic of extremism meeting accountability. The immediate political impact was severe. Republican politicians who had been planning to hire Miller distanced themselves. His planned think tank on immigration policy lost its funding as donors fled. Speaking engagements were canceled. Law firms that had been considering him quietly withdrew their interest. The emails Crockett revealed became evidence in multiple lawsuits against the federal government over family separation. Immigration advocacy groups used Miller's own family history in campaigns highlighting the hypocrisy of anti-immigrant rhetoric. Young Jewish activists particularly embraced the confrontation, seeing it as exposing how some descendants of refugees had become oppressors themselves.